This meta model was invented by the originators of a, don't know what to call it, an outfit. It's not an outfit, but an approach, an orientation called neuro-linguistic programming. Some of you may have heard of it. These people were, actually it was founded by two people, a linguist named Richard Bandler at the University of California. No, actually, John Grinder, linguist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and his sidekick, Richard Bandler, who was if I remember correctly, a bad boy with no particular disciplinary credentials. And they invented this thing which was based partly on general semantics, but also on a lot of other things. And they called it neuro-linguistic programming without fessing up that they just stole the term neuro-linguistic from Korzybski. You're already familiar with that term. And they called it neuro-linguistic programming instead of neuro-linguistic training in order to be modern. But actually a lot of people find the term programming offensive there. And we're going to talk really soon about offensive terms in the context of general semantics. What does it mean to relate to the formulation offensive terms? So this is, it's a, they've actually identified 11 or 12 linguistic patterns into which most, if not all, formulations in the English language or in any language would fit. And they've also invented ways of challenging those patterns. This is meaningless. Maybe I should give you some examples. I'm using abbreviations. One of the patterns, I'll just talk about 3 of them today, but I'm going to be giving you out handouts which sort of summarize the meta model, so you can look at it yourselves and get more of an idea of what it's about before next time. Linguists like inventing terms like this, and I'm sort of conservative as far as terminology goes, so since these are the terms they've invented, I'm persisting with it. This stands for unspecified referential index. Unspecified referential index.
Could you write them a bit bigger on the board?
I'll try. Starting now. Unspecified referential index, URI. Best example of that for Canadians is the term Canadians. I heard a little clip of Michael Ignatieff on CBC Radio the other day. It must have lasted about 10 seconds. He must have used about 30 words, and 10 of those words were Canadians. Canadians are this, Canadians are that, this is not good for Canadians. So it's an unspecified referential index. In other words, he's not telling us which Canadians specifically he's talking about. So the question is which. When you learn the meta model, it's actually a set of extensional devices. I would call them a set of extensional devices. They don't have the sort of philosophical or structural depth of Korzybski's extensional devices, but they're a lot easier to learn, and they're actually very useful in relating to language that purports to be a description or an explanation of what is going on. So I've learned it very thoroughly, and it's like in my unconscious for 20 years. So whenever I hear a word like Canadians, or Americans, or Jews, or Zionists, or anything like that, I go, well, which Canadians specifically are you talking about? And that's a challenge. So it either has to be answered or passed over, but whatever happens, you know what's going on. In politics, people will use the term Canadians in order to avoid recognizing the differences among Canadians, and in order to construct a false consensus of Canadians. Even more obvious is the constant use of the term we. We this, we that, and it's ubiquitous and constant in every discourse. In every discourse, the use of the term we. Like, we have just discovered planets outside of the solar system. That's a social scientific bias. Planets outside of the solar system. Oh yeah, well, I had nothing to do with it. What is this we? We are destroying the environment. Oh yeah, I mean, who is this we? Etc. etc. We are, we this, that. Okay, so that's unspecified referential. And now you've got it. Let's see. Another one is. Okay. Well. Let's take unspecified verb. Unspecified verb. Is that big enough, Albert?
It's big enough.
Okay. Unspecified verb. The rich are exploiting the poor. Now, perhaps everyone in this room would like to agree with that. I don't know. I mean, it's on the face of things an unobjectionable statement from a left-wing point of view. Although I might have trouble with the implication there that the rich are a group of people who are engaged as a matter of personal policy in the exploitation of the poor. See? The term rich is an unspecified referential index, or which rich specifically. And the term poor is also an unspecified referential index, well, which poor specifically. But the unspecified verb here is exploit. It's a verb. Exploit. It's an action term, but it's unspecified. So the challenge to that one is how specifically are the rich exploiting the poor? And then you have a great variety of answers that could emerge. The Marxist answer would have to do with surplus value. The liberal answer would have to do with greed. The conservative answer would have to do with the failure to live up to one's obligations as an aristocrat. That kind of thing. Maybe the next one I'll take is deletion. Deletion simply means leaving out. Now, we already know that any linguistic formulation is going to leave out a lot of what is going on at the object level. I may be talking more about deletion specifically, again, because it covers a lot of ground. But there's a variety of deletion called comparative deletion. And the question would be compared to what? For example, if I say the brutal Lower Slavovians' brutal occupation of Upper Slabovia. Lower and Upper Slabovia are maybe familiar to people over the age of 60 who followed a comic strip called Lil Abner. Or over the age of 45.
Nice.
I'm just no Freedonian.
Okay. The Upper Slavovian brutal occupation of Lower Slabovia. The operative term there is brutal, and we want to know compared to what is it brutal? I mean, this occupation is brutal compared to what other occupations? Is there such a thing as a continuum of brutality of occupations? So that whenever I see the word brutal or hear it used in discourse, whenever I hear the word occupation, almost always, it's accompanied by the term brutal. So the question arises, is there such a thing as a non-brutal occupation? Or brutal compared to what? So compared to what is the comparative deletion? Well, I'll give you one other example since we're starting to talk about a branch of politics that's been bugging me a lot lately, and that is Middle Eastern politics. You know that Upper and Lower Slabovia are between the Tigris and the Euphrates. You might not have known that. But when some of you have heard maybe a lot about the massacres during the First or Second Lebanon War, the massacres at Sabra and Shatila. But a lot of information is left out there. And a lot of people think that the massacres were actually carried out by Israelis. Well, that deletes the information that the massacres were actually carried out by Christian Arabs, phalangists, Lebanese. So it was Arabs killing Arabs. But then there's even more information to uncover there, and that is that the phalangists weren't just massacring because they were evil, brutal people, but because they themselves had been massacred by Palestinians 10 or 15 years earlier. In other words, Christian villages had been destroyed and people massacred by their enemy in the Lebanese Civil War. And if you start following the story and recovering deletions, you'll find a history of massacres going back for I don't know how long. So massacre actually is very often a matter of vengeance. And the whole topic of vengeance is elided or deleted usually in the discussions of massacres by observers of political events. So that might be enough for the meta model for today. There's a total of 10 or 11. There's different versions of the meta model. I have a version of 11 patterns. So I've talked a little bit about 3 of them. Okay. All right, thank you. All right. So this is Ellis's version here. Here we have a circle. He's saying that's the self. It can't be rated. It's neither worthwhile nor worthless. It's beyond comparative evaluation. C'est moi, right? Or toi. And so I say, here's the event level and here's the object level. So I say self 1 is self at the event level. That's the world. So when I look at you, I look at the world. When you look at me, you look at the world. When I feel myself at this level, there's a very fuzzy boundary between self and world, and that boundary has perhaps even disappeared, and I'm having a mystical experience of unity, or what Freud would call an oceanic feeling at the dissolution of that boundary. And if I'm the world, you're not going to evaluate me, as worthwhile or worthless unless you're being really silly. Okay? I mean, who am I to evaluate the world? By the way, sentimental version of this is like, when I look at you, I'm looking at God, or I can see the sacred in you. Well, that's a way of talking about it that, I can tolerate it sometimes, but obviously not today. I can acknowledge that I'm looking at the world when I look at you, or at the cosmos, but today I don't feel like saying I'm looking at God or at the sacred. Today I don't feel like that. And also, if we avoid that kind of language, we avoid disputations about alternative religious and theological terminologies. But I mentioned this book by Krishnamurti called, that Laura knew about, called You Are the World. All right, so here is self, and here's where I think, well, there could be all kinds of levels within the object level for different purposes. Well, I don't want to get into it, but you'll soon see what I mean. And here are the stories. And these are stories that are being lived by the self. So we don't want to be misled by the map here into thinking that there's an actual space-time distinction between object and label levels here, or between the self and the stories that are being lived by the self. They are simultaneous. But the thing is, or Ellis calls them experiences of the self. And he's saying, yes, go ahead and rate your experiences as worthy or worthwhile, or other people's experiences as worthy or worthless. Well, it's hard to think of any experience that's completely worthless. But that's just a footnote. But you can't rate yourself, right? Because that would be identifying levels. And identifying levels, as we've already learned, is unsane. All right, so then I go to the place where I advise you to follow your breath. And some people would say that if there's anything valuable about this teaching, it's the teaching of the following of the breath, but I'm not a fanatic to that extent. And there's many different things that could be said about following the breath. At the object level, all you can say really about following the breath is that we're following the breath. I mean, we're using ordinary descriptive English, following the breath. Who's going to argue with that? Once we get into more abstract formulations, then there's stuff to argue. about and or discussed. But for me, in this context, chain index, what's important about following the breath is that I am actually engaged in the sensory experience of this existence here. We could call it self beyond stories. When I follow my breath, I'm leaving verbal thinking behind and a lot of sort of emotional stuff behind. I'm not leaving it behind, but I'm diverting attention from it. I'm focusing my attention on the breath body, the body breath, and that's self beyond stories. So it's a kind of escape from the stories, or it's a liberation from identification with the stories that I am living. And I can evaluate those stories, but I can't evaluate the self that is living them. Now, this little kid that you're looking at there is Adolf Hitler. So it helps when you're looking at my favorite.
He still has that bowl cut comb over him.
Yeah, you can see that murder in his eyes already. A good whipping might have lashed it out of him at the time, but they didn't get to him. You know, if they'd thrown him in the juvenile clink early enough, maybe mankind would have been spared so many wars. Anyway, it helps to think of maybe of a person as baby or child, of self as baby or child.
I want to put him on camera.
I forget where I got that. I'm so bad with references. So my question here when I was formulating this task, what I was trying to do was to give the student an experience of recognizing or of experiencing the self beyond stories in others. So if I want to experience the self beyond stories in myself, I follow my breath. There's so much more I could say about this form of meditation practice, but it would be a violation of the rule of contextuality in this context. Now, what about looking at others? So I picked up on a bunch of different things, and I came together with this. I got this task together. Actually, I was partly inspired by Jackson's speech about somebody. To repeat after him, I may be on dope, but I am somebody. He's trying to get them away from the stories that they're living of drugs and prostitution and prison and crime and shit, trying to release them from identification with their stories and to get them to focus on the somebody, that is the self beyond stories. I don't think he meant them to think that they were important or precious or valuable, like as when we lie through our teeth and say that every human life is precious. Okay, I take it back. But it's not about every human life being precious. It's about every human life being a human life that can't be identified with the stories that it is immersed in or identified with or trapped in, entrapped. Okay? We can get entrapped in the stories that we are being lived by. We could say we're living the stories, or we can say we're being lived by the stories. So it's a work of liberation to experience this distinction. So it's a work of liberation for self, and it also has to be a work of liberation in our experience with others. So that's why in the task, can I see the thing there? So that's why in the task I get people first to pay attention to the other and describe them in ordinary descriptive English. 4 persons, one of whom you know quite well, and I get them to follow these instructions and to copy out these instructions and to say to themselves, this person is somebody, a somebody, etc., etc., etc. And directly from our Buddhist meditation, this person does not want to suffer, this person wants to be happy. I think I would leave that out in the next version that we may begin to construct, or not. Okay, so this is what gets me going on here. I'm marking the tasks, and one student at the bottom line in his or her description of their experience with this task comes to the conclusion, this is at the bottom line, it's quite a phrase, our similarities are more important than our differences. Well, there's nothing wrong with, there's nothing totally wrong or false about such a statement. Our similarities are more important than our differences. However, we've already learned that those are sort of elementalistic terms. Our similarities are more important than our differences, as if you could separate similarities and differences and say that some are more important than the other. And that's just the beginning of the qualms that I have with this statement, that a student is sincerely trying to convey her experience after having done this task. And that's the conclusion that he comes to. But mainly my problem with it is that it ignores the multi-ordinality of ourselves. When we say ourselves similarities are more important than our differences, it's a single flat statement at one level. It ignores the differences between the levels of self, event level, object level, and label levels. So what are we going to do about it? So at this point I share my thoughts, literally, just written within the past 2 weeks on this. Well, my intention in constructing the task was to shift attention from the label level at which such comparative statements can be made. This is a comparative statement. It's nothing without comparison. In fact, most statements at the label level involve comparison, if not all. So our similarities are more important than our differences is a judgment at a high level of abstraction at the label level involving the highly abstract concepts of similarity and difference, and I'm trying to direct, in this task, I'm trying to direct attention maybe to a particular level within the object level at which such comparative statements cannot be made. Look, at the object level, I have a small nose, you have a big nose. That's ordinary descriptive English, so we're talking about differences even though we're at the object level. So this is why I started thinking about differences of level within the object level, but there's a limit to the distance that we want to go in making distinctions, because then we lose the ability to think. So my objective was to shift attention to the object level where self and other are incomparable and inconceivable and are not subject to categorization as similar, different, etc. All right, so then I say, well, there's something wrong with the task as I assigned it, because a lot of people got halfway on this, didn't go all the way in their descriptions on the task, and I realized I myself had gotten part way and not all the way in dealing with this. Look, we could say, if we want to go back to the label level, I don't think that we should say, even just strictly at the label level, that our similarities are more important than our differences. I think our similarities are more important in some respects and in some contexts and for some purposes. And our differences are more important in some respects and some contexts and some purposes. So even at that level, it's liberal piety to say, oh, our similarities are more important than our differences. And it's kind of multicultural piety to say, oh, our differences have to be recognized over and above our similarity. So it falls into this kind of two-valued tug-of-war between similarity and difference. And, I have a limited tolerance for that after 1,000 years of exposure to it. So, this is the best I can come up with at that level. It would be better to say that for some contexts and for some purposes our similarities are more important, and that in others our differences are more important. And there's still other maybe contexts in which one shouldn't say anything at all, even at the label level, about similarities and differences. Okay. So formulations like I am somebody, which I got people to work with in the task, Or a formulation like the living, breathing human being. Okay, this is a singular, living, breathing human being, much larger than the labels, roles, identities, narratives, etc. that it contains. Much larger than the roles, identities, narratives, etc. which it contains. That's meant to point to the being beyond stories, to self too. And self one, I guess, also is self beyond stories to the extent that it is a self anymore at all. And some people actually, a few people unconsciously changed this person is somebody to this person is a somebody. And I give a little shiver because they've immediately taken the word somebody, which I'm trying to get beyond labels, although it is a label. It's kind of a paradoxical effort. If I say this person is a somebody, I'm creating the category of somebodies, and I'm assigning this person to the category of somebodies. So hey, I don't want to be nitpicked too much, but there's a significant difference between saying I am somebody and saying I am a somebody. Because I am somebody points away from labels, and I am a somebody gets me right back into them. Maybe it's a kind of nitpicking. So Korzybski would intervene here to say, Horowitz, your problem is that you don't take the structural differential seriously enough. I mean, you introduce the structural differential and you talk about practice with a structural differential and working with a structural differential, but really the most important thing about the structural differential is that people should be constantly going shh. All right? Whatever you say about yourself is not yourself. Whatever you say about the other is not the other. That kind of thing. Well, whatever you say about persons is not the person. So Horowitz, your problem is that you simply burst into speech about the person. You talk sometimes about the delay, the pause, which delays bursting into speech about something. Horowitz bursts into speech. Well, this is the class in which Horowitz is, bursting into speech constantly. Okay, well, that's just an observation about the structural differential. What follows is a kind of salad of observations as I struggle with the problems with the task, because I think this is very important, especially in leading up to where we're going on nonviolence in the Spirit course. I recall the Buddhist formulation, which also uses language to try and get away from linguistic distinctions, which is the sort of paradoxical task involved. Although it falls flat on its face also by saying, to the enlightened, there is no one who is superior to me. There is no one who is inferior to me, and there is no one who is equal to me. No one is inferior, no one is superior, no one is equal. Points to this level that I'm trying to get the task to take people to, where there is nothing to be said about the person, where no comparative evaluations are appropriate. That we could easily translate that into no one is similar, no one is different. Hey, no one is similar to anyone else, and no one is different from anyone else. Oh, it violates Aristotle's first law of logic. Well, that's what it's all about. I mean, that's what a lot of this is about. It's violating Aristotle's law of identity. Law of identity, the law of difference, and the so-called law of the excluded middle. An attempt to use concept to evade concepts, of course, can be a debilitating pastime for philosophers, so we move quickly to another thought. Oh, but here's another one. I'll steal philosopher stuff for a while. Another formulation that might be useful here is, I think it starts with Agamben, who talks about the community of those who have nothing in common. Where what we have in common is our, I suppose, death. Where what we have in common is our inconceivability. That's also a linguistic formulation that points away from the label level. A label that points away from the label level. The community of those who have nothing in common. Well, for those who like it, that might help. Then I found something else by Beatrice Spivak. I wish I had the reference for this one, because it's a fairly substantial quotation from Spivak, for which I've lost the reference, who is the Derrida's translator and an important feminist post-colonial theorist and commentator on Derrida. So somewhere she writes something similar. I think she's trying for formulation that is somewhat similar to this notion of somebody. She writes, she's talking about the proper name. And in discussing the proper name, a name like she chooses Beatrice. Korzybski would say Beatrice Smith, or just Smith. But Spivak is a feminist. She chooses Beatrice. And she says the proper name is a mark rather than a sign. So she introduces this distinction between the mark and the sign. The proper name is a mark. A mark indicates a person bypassing the sign system, she says. So that's bypassing the label level. A mark is a kind of symbol, or look, the word mark is a mark. It's a word. The word mark is the word mark, so it's a word, it's a label, but it bypasses the system of labels. The word somebody for Jackson, I think, was trying to do the same work. But Jackson's not going to get up there getting all those people to say, Mark, it's easier to say, I am somebody. Bypassing the sign system, which is the system of labels, of classifications. She says the word Beatrice isn't withdrawn from the sign system because it is a word. It's like in this territory between object and label levels, right, that I was trying to get to with sensory grounded language, for example. This way of using words that just juts right up against the object level as close as it can get without, of course, actually ever being able to cross the divide. Because whatever you say is not what it's about. It points to the individual at the object level. It bypasses the level of stories. That's how I would put it. Spivak says, insofar as it refers to a named individual, it is a mark. Okay, so it's bypassing the level at where selves are rated or compared. We got to say this is Beatrice, not this is a Beatrice. Right? If we say this is a Beatrice, it's no longer a mark. It's become a sign. That's why the proper name is important rather than the family name. This is Gad. If I say this is Horowitz, I'm identifying myself with an extremely disturbing history of labels that goes back for 1,000 years. Gad, it's also a word. It's one of the 12 tribes, etc., etc. I could talk about that one too, but I'm pointing to myself when I say Gad. If I say this is a Gad, then I'm talking about everyone who has that name, and not just about me. I'm trying to explain why I objected to the student writing a somebody instead of just somebody. A little bit too Talmudic for you? Okay, so we could take this statement, our similarities are more important than our differences, as the lesson to be learned from the task. I'm not rejecting it.
I get it.
Was it you? You're not the only one.
Okay.
Okay, so we can take that statement, our similarities are more important than our differences, as the lesson to be learned from the task, and reformulate it to take account of the multi-ordinality of the self. We could reformulate it thus. More important than our similarities hyphen differences. More important than our similarities differences is our inconceivable aliveness. Just an effort. So that's where I wanted the task. That kind of place is where I wanted the task, with the metaphor of place, to get people to. And this event and object level is the ground of whatever similarities and differences may arise. So it is more important in that sense than whatever similarities, differences may arise. At the same time, though, well, I begin to segue here to the matter of violence, which is the uber topic of this term. Yeah.
Can we ask you a question?
Sure.
Ask a question. So, the more important than our similarities and differences is our inconceivable liveness.
Aliveness.
Aliveness.
Yeah.
So is that, I mean, immediately there I thought of Deleuze's idea of like life energy. And
Sure.
So that's what that is.
Well, I wouldn't
Or-
equate it, but it's in the same general territory. And there are lots of other different ways of expressing this. But what's good about general semantics is we can teach it in kindergarten without teaching them to mouth hypocritical pap. In doing this work with somebody, in doing a task like this with somebody, now I haven't reformulated it, but I've expressed some reactions to the work that was done by the students on it, which make me think that this task has to be reformulated so it has more chance of getting people there. I don't know how to do it. I do have one idea, which I'll share with you in a moment. But what I'll say now is that in doing this work, we can see how this is actually something that was very important to Korzybski, because his whole project, as they say, emerged in World War I, in which he was a participant, in which he was crippled. So war, violence, is a large part of the problem of insanity or manifestation of insanity. So the work for sanity is also a work for peace. You can't work for sanity without and ignore the problem of war or violence. So you don't want to. I mean, your objective is not to make sure that all war criminals are punished. Your objective is to abolish war. As I would see it, we may not be able to abolish. We may not be able to abolish all forms of violence. In fact, it would be impossible. But we could abolish war. I mentioned this before. There's been a regression from the human ambition to abolish war to the human ambition to seek vengeance in the form of punishment of war criminals. That is a major regression, as far as I'm concerned, where the left gets obsessed with punishing war criminals. That's quite a regression. Anyway, we'll come back to it, especially when we talk about Gandhi. So, we're doing the work of nonviolence insofar as violence involves reducing persons to their stories. Reducing persons to their stories. Which is what even a statement like our similarities are more important than our differences will do. It reduces persons to their similar and different stories. It identifies them with their identities, roles, stories, etc. And a number of continental philosophers are, quite concerned about the problem of the violence of language per se. So this is the kind of territory that we're now abutting on. Well, some languages could be less violent than others. So maybe we could stop talking about the violence of language per se, which they all do, and start seeking a less violent language. So this is partly what I think Korzybski is about. I'm convinced of it. He's about that, among other things. a politics of alterity rather than difference. It would have to be a politics of alterity, maybe not rather than difference, but about a politics of alterity as well as, and somehow more fundamentally than a politics of identity difference. And insofar as a work like this, a task like this, if you take Hitler as one of the four persons that you're looking at, if it diminishes our tendency, there it is. I mean, I'm using it, but every time I use the unspecified referential index, I think I know what I'm doing. Our tendency to demonize others, and who could be a bigger, really useful demon than Hitler? I mean, what would we do without him in political bullshit? And the use of the anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi diatribe. So if it reduces our tendency to demonize others and seek not justice, whatever that is, but vengeance, retribution, etc., what Korzybski calls animal righteousness. What a lovely little phrase. I love it. Animal righteousness. I'll say more about it as we move along. Oh, I can do it. I'm good at it. We all are, to greater or lesser extents, and that also depends a lot on whether any particular ox of ours is being gored at the moment, to coin a phrase. Animal righteousness. Well, here's a little bit more. And this came to me a few days later, so it's on a separate piece of paper. Well, when I was reading this task, some students, it's happened in previous years, but I only really noticed it this year. You know, the more you teach something, the more you learn, up to a point, I guess, where you just become a robot, a teaching robot. But we're all either familiar with that or will be at some point in our histories. I was struck by a comment that a number of people made when they were looking at a person that they knew very well, that it made them sad, or something like that, to apply this task to a person they knew very well, because it made the particular features of the person that were important to them kind of fade into the background. And they're just looking at the person, as somebody who sort of deserves to live, would deserve to live whether they were very important to me or not, for example. And whenever I came across this comment before in the task, I would think, oh, poo, but now I'm sort of getting it. But this year, for the first time, someone writes that in doing this task, in focusing on the person beyond stories, particular features of the person's appearance at the object level would fade out. And that's interesting because the task begins with instructing you to pay attention to particularly those features. So I don't know if I would eliminate that from the task or not. Maybe it's okay to get people, like as a trick, to get you to really pay attention to a person, to get you to describe their particular appearance. But then it's a trick that could backfire, because then you could be lost in particular features of the person that are loved by you or hated by you or attractive to you or unattractive to you. So the task itself would militate against itself by drawing you into particular features that are related to the stories being lived by them. That's one of these areas of fuzziness in the boundary between object and label level that are really difficult for me to deal with. So, got to live with it and use it. Distinctions within distinctions. These particular features that are related to the stories that are being lived by them become less important. Okay, so if I'm in Jackson's audience and I'm looking at the people around me, and because we're all going, I am somebody. So it's hundreds of people going, I am somebody, together. And I'm looking at us and them and me, and I see how they are dressed, and I see the ravages of crack on their faces, and I see their torn running shoes, and so on and so forth. Well, and I'm right back in the stories that they're living. So I'm not going to do that. But Jackson is too smart for that. He gets them to say, I am somebody. So it diverts their attention from the object level markers of the stories that they're living to what we might call the sheer presence of the person. Now when you're looking at, when you're experiencing your own sheer presence by focusing on the breath, or when you're focusing somehow, this is what I'm trying to get to, an equivalent of that for the other, on the sheer presence of the other, then those particular features will fade into the background, and it won't matter at all what particular historical ravages the bodily object level betrays. It will matter. I can't say it won't matter. I'll say it's got to matter a lot less. The color of their skin will matter less. And Jackson has to end this thing with "black is beautiful." Yeah? The color of their skin would matter less, and the content of their character would also matter less. Never mind the content of their character. I mean, the content of Hitler's character at that point is close to zero, but that's just a way into the older Hitler, the one who would have been hung at Nuremberg if he had lived. What comes more into focus or into the foreground is the sheer being of the person, beyond stories. Now, it would be misleading. I'm tempted at this point to say, okay, so similarities are more important than our differences. But it's not sheer being as a concept or a category which contains everyone. It's the sheer being of this person, we're saying. Okay? We're, again, trying to escape category. Interesting to look at Dorothy Lee's work on valuing the self, in which she describes how various hunter-gatherer communities approach this issue. But this term I got from her, the sheer being, that hunter-gatherer community, if they haven't developed much of a class system, will value every person for the sheer being of that person, rather than for their excellence as a hunter, necessarily, or something like that. Which evolutionary psychologists today just refuse to believe. Okay? And is that a religion or what? Is evolutionary psychology a religion? It's a bourgeois religion. Well, we can learn from bourgeois religions. They're not absolute shit. Well, I did mention in class this thing that I actually picked up in a hypnosis manual. Not a manual, but a big book about hypnosis. I can't remember the title of it, of course, but the author was a guy named Boyne. So I call it the Boyne fallacy, or the Boyne tautology. I mentioned it last time. And Martin was quick to recognize it as tautology, but still I think it's a precious tautology. And we could do it with Hitler there. Okay? Exactly the same experiences as Hitler in the womb, in his mother's womb. And if after birth I'd had exactly the same experiences and in exactly the same sequence as Hitler, then I would be Hitler. And I would have made exactly the same choices as Hitler at exactly the same moments. That's the final solution right there. It's the final solution to the final solution. The meta-final solution. Of course, I don't know. This is hyperbole. I'm exaggerating. Another version of this comes out of NLP, actually. When NLP instructs its therapists on how to relate to clients, patients, and so on, some of the clients are, really unappetizing types. So how do you relate to a client with what the Rogerians call unconditional positive regard? Because I think most people who know about therapy would admit that what they all have in common that is most important is that you have to have a sort of positive relationship with the client in order to get anywhere. And some people would say that's all you need, is a positive relationship with the client in order to do therapeutic work. And Rogers was the great teacher of this approach, Carl Rogers, client-centered therapy. later called person-centered therapy. Well, we were taught that any given person, given all of the resources that are available to them at the moment of decision, we're talking about a moment of decision. People talk these days about making bad decisions or making bad choices. That is an advance in language. It's a coin that is soon devalued. I mean, it's meant to enable people to escape from pointless guilt, but actually it just becomes another way of inducing guilt. They made very bad decisions or bad choices. But that's exactly what it's about. So given Hitler's resources in September 1942, his psychological and social resources, those at his disposal, and given all of the external causes and conditions, we could use the Buddhist term causes and conditions. Given all the causes and conditions at play, inside and outside the skin, at a given moment, he made the very best decisions that he could. Well, what does this do to the problem of free will? Maybe we'll have time later to talk about it. It makes free will prospective rather than retrospective. In retrospect, there's no free will. Prospectively, there's free will in the sense that I can be influenced. If my decision is the kind that could have been influenced by others, then it might even make sense to put someone in jail as a deterrent, which would involve changing his future decisions. Of course, in our criminal justice system, it's likely to make his future decisions worse. The point is, we could think non-mechanistically of the person as a decision-making system. So whatever factors are in play, the decision comes out. However, one of the factors in play at the very next moment is an influence that's going to be exerted that will change, that will improve the quality of the decision-making apparatus so that future decisions can be more sane. So that's what it's about. And that's how, when you're thinking about criminal justice or restorative justice or anything like that, again, when we get to Gandhi, I'll have more to say about something like that. But I think that this is a true tautology, or a worthwhile tautology. And I don't know, I sort of get lost in these alternative formulations that could have been fed into the task to help people to see the other beyond stories. Hey, both of these, the Boyne thing and the thing about the thing from NLP, you could think of them as forms of substitution. So if you know Levinas, there's a lot of ground to be covered before one could make any of this relevant to Levinas. But Levinas has the very important notion of substituting for the other. So what does it mean to substitute for the other? I think it means to have some sort of recognition of the kind that I've just been talking about. Hey, or as Christian religion puts it, there but for the grace of God go I.
With the grace of God goes someone else.
Sorry?
There, with the grace of God,
yes,
goes someone else.
Exactly right. So the grace of God here is a term that fills in for what I'm calling causes and conditions. Now, someone might have trouble with a term like the grace of God, but I don't think anyone living in the 21st century could have a problem with the notion of the importance of causes and conditions, even though Buddhists were first to recognize it 3,000 years ago, without any God at play, really, in their thinking. Anyway, one thing is sure, that in a reformulation of this task, I would have to somehow direct people to the sheer being of the person, just to the presence, the sheer presence of the person. When I'm focusing on the breath, I'm present to my own presence, to myself, or something like that. I'm not thinking. That's why getting away from thinking is so important in meditation. It's not that thinking is bad. It's not that you want to be thoughtless. It's that you're directing attention to the self beyond stories, And our connection with our stories is very importantly a matter of thinking. Okay? Well, the Office of Coincidence Control is at work. So for some reason, I don't read this kind of stuff usually, but for some reason I got into reading Stephen King's novel, The Green Mile. Is anyone familiar with that? It seems a movie was made out of it, which also got a lot of play. And as a microunit within a microunit, my sister-in-law Marty has just been watching the movie at the same time as I was reading the book. So it's a message from the Office of Coincidence Control. The narrator is someone who's working in an American prison who's in charge of electrocuting murderers. So year after year after year, he's electrocuting murderers. And as someone who's in charge of electrocuting murderers on the electric chair known as Old Sparky, he gets to know the murderers as people, and he likes some and hates others. He has to kill them all equally because they've all committed murder. That's the story they were living. And they have to suffer the consequences. And hey, I'm not even talking here about any kind of opposition to the death penalty, because I'm not sure that I am simply opposed to the death penalty given the present context without changing anything else, sort of as an escape from changing anything else, a typical liberal escape from changing anything else. Focus on one little thing like that. Anyway, on page 44, this character, Delacroix, from Louisiana, but we could think of him as a Quebecer. He has killed half a dozen people. I think he's burned some of them to death. So he's a murderer. But in prison, he's not a murderer. In prison, the murderers are behind him. I mean, he can't escape the consequences of his actions, of course. Things get a little tricky. And Delacroix becomes a favorite of the electrocution squad because in prison he's a nice little guy. And he has a pet mouse that everyone adores. And the mouse plays an important role in the Green Mile, believe it or not. So he's about to be electrocuted, and they're helping him up the step towards Old Sparky. And it's only 8 or so inches up from the floor. Now, are we going to put ourselves in Delacroix's shoes? So it's only 8 or 10 inches up from the floor, the platform that leads to the electric chair. But you'd be surprised how many of these, even the toughest of tough babies, need help to make that last step up of their lives. So the electrocution squad has to help him up. They help him up onto that step. Del did okay, though. He stood in front of the chair for a moment and then actually spoke to it, as if introducing himself. C'est moi, he said. And then he gets the juice, and Del is breathing in great dry pulls of air, lungs that would be charred bags less than 4 minutes from now, laboring to keep up with his fear-driven heart. The fact that he had killed half a dozen people seemed at that moment the least important thing about him. I'm not trying to say anything about right and wrong here, says Stephen King, but only to tell how it was. The fact that he'd killed half a dozen people seemed at that moment the least important thing about him. That following the c'est moi just sort of blew me away for a few seconds. Now I'm back in my cynical human body. And I should pause for station identification. This is Radical General Semantics. Korzybski had no interest in prison reform. He was a tough baby. I'm going to be talking about abolishing the prison system, criminal justice, not just reforming it. But that's later. That's for later. So what I've been doing so far is just reacting to your reaction to the last task of first term. So is there any comment or question? Well, here's another meta-model pattern. It's called lost performative. It's like what we would call a value judgment. Bandler and Grinder call a lost performative. In other words, we need an answer to this question. According to whom and according to what criteria? So this adjective brutal, for example, and a brutal occupation, it's a comparative deletion, but it's also a lost performative. Brutal is quite a brutal value judgment. So you got to ask not only compared to what, you got to also ask according to whom, and according to what criteria.
The example of Hitler, and if you had have gone through the same living experience, had the same...
From the moment of conception.
From the moment of conception. But here's the question, I don't know how to frame it, but...
Yeah.
Like, couldn't there be something, like even if it was the very same, couldn't there be something else that would have had a different outcome? Like, isn't...
Yeah, but I'm saying given the same causes and conditions. For example, if he'd been accepted into art school,
yeah.
he would have gone to New York and maybe become a buddy of Andy Warhol. And either World War II would still happen, but it probably would have happened differently.
There's a science fiction novel where he does go to New York and
Yes.
become
There's a
a
movie.
science fiction writer.
There's a movie where he's Hitler as an artist.
Mm.
So basically, all the way up, there's always, this is really important to me, all the way, there's always that chance for something happening right until the moment of death.
In the next moment.
In the next moment.
Not in the moment just past,
Right.
but in this moment,
But-
the next moment.
Yeah, I'm confused about what happens to choice in this conception of...
It happens now.
Okay.
Let's put it
It
this
still
way.
happens, right?
Let's let you finish your question.
Well, it seems like that conception of a person is determined by their genes and their upbringing eclipses choice. Am I misunderstanding that?
Well, it's easy to get into that, and if I have time, I'll talk a lot about determinism versus free will towards the end. But the thing is, any living being is a choice-making apparatus, and the human being is an especially complicated and sophisticated choice-making apparatus. So the choices, I don't make a distinction between the causes and the conditions and the chooser.
Okay.
It's the problem of elementalism.
Gotcha.
If you make the distinction, then you say, oh, am I just a puppet?
Right.
But if you don't make the distinction, the question, am I just a puppet, does not arise. No, I'm making a choice in this moment as the next moment in this flow of the world which I am.
Right.
And my choices can be altered in the next moment by feedback from others. Like, that's why in the criminal law we put some people in jail, because we think that they could have done otherwise if the right influences had been in place then. And if they could not have done otherwise, no matter what, then we put them in a mental hospital. So yes, there is voluntary behavior, but voluntary behavior is caused. And when I paused, did you notice I paused and I said, well, let's give him time to answer the question. That was a result of decades of programming by others who were trying to get me to shut up for a minute so that they could get a word in edgewise. So given all the causes and conditions, I just interrupt. But at a certain point, the social changes me. And I stop being as much of an interrupter, anyway. I mean, someone's asking a question, right? Or as Shannon says, I'm going to finish my sentence. Because she's one of those influences. What else? This is a really interesting topic. I'll just mention two books, James, that have been very influential on me on this. One of them is by Ted Ondrick, who's now a crazy philosopher in England, the brother of Beland Ondrick, former, maybe present publisher of the Toronto Star. He's got a book called How Free Are You? The other one is by a guy named Barry Barnes, I think it is, and he's also in England, but he's a sociologist, and he's got a book called something like Explaining Agency, because that's what your question is about. Explaining agency. It's not about we're punishing you because you could have done otherwise. No, you could not have done otherwise, but you sure as hell are not going to do it again, is the purpose of punishment.
I guess it's that stipulation that we couldn't have done otherwise.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely am sympathetic to that view, but
Given all the causes and conditions in place, including what you had for breakfast.
Mhm. I just know people would dispute that.
I know, a lot
Looking
of people
for ammo.
do that. And we want to talk later, Pondrick actually talks about why people have such a strong investment in disputing that. It has to do with the loss of the same kind of freedom in praising self and in blaming others.
Yeah.
We lose that. But we don't lose the ability to get angry and disapprove and try and change things. We don't lose that.
Mhm.
Anyway, probably more on that later. I hope more on that later. Look, if Hitler had taken a break in 1934, at the very moment that he was assassinating Rome and the SA, and solidifying his alliance with the bourgeoisie in Germany, if somebody heard about Korzybski's seminars in Chicago and gone to take a seminar and come back to Berlin, this is just ridiculous, isn't it? But it would have taken something to change him. It's not something that he would have screwed out of himself, lifting himself up by his own bootstraps. It would have taken something to change him. What if, like Mussolini, Hitler had had a Jewish lover for 10 years? Okay? Well, why did Mussolini happens to have had a Jewish lover for 10 years, which means he had a lot of trouble being an anti-Semite, which is good.
And it didn't really stop Heidegger.
Sorry, Shannon?
Oh, no, I was just saying it didn't really stop Heidegger all
Well,
that much.
Heidegger was not much of an anti-Semite.
That's true,
He was
actually.
not much of an anti-Semite. Maybe he was,
Maybe he
was,
did that.
He was an opportunistic anti-Semite, maybe, but so was everybody else.
A dinner party.
In your answer to James, I mean, because you've got two things here that you're holding together, right?
Mhm.
On the one hand, up until the moment of death, there's always that respective moment.
And maybe after death.
And after, yes, I would go with that.
Maybe, yeah.
That it can be altered. Okay,
Yes.
okay. On the other hand, in your answer or discussion with James, it's that given those circumstances, you have no other. There's been no other choice in that instant. So how can you hold both of those together?
Well, it violates Aristotle's law. I'm not even sure that it violates Aristotle's law of identity because I'm putting a lot of emphasis on the distinction between the previous moment, this moment, and the next moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the spirit class, in the first few years, at this point, I would do something like this. You know, I would take a piece of chalk, throw it at the wall.
Could you do that again for the camera?
You can aim it at someone.
Yeah, could you?
Take a piece of chalk. Let's take a blue piece this time because we want to be pluralistic. Oh, throw it at the wall.
Georges, great.
Shannon, you don't like that, but you see, when I first did it, maybe you don't like that. There's another meta-model pattern called mind reading, which I just evinced. The communists want to destroy our way of life. Well, we're reading the communist mind there. Like, how do we know that the communists want to destroy our way of life? It really seems as if it was their own way of life that they were intent on destroying. But anyway, where were we? Yes. Well, at the moment that I first did that, all the causes and conditions were I got to do something to show that a voluntary action, you know, can be out to lunch, can be crazy, can be for a pedagogic purpose. And then after a while, I do it consciously. And the decision kicks in immediately. The decision comes to me. I don't make a decision. The decision emerges out of all my past moments. The decision emerges now, and I do it. And hey, if the chairperson says never throw a piece of chalk at the wall again, I'm not going to do it again. Okay, let's move on, okay, because you've hit on a tricky point that A, I'm going to come back to, and B, as we work more on violence, because that's what it's about too. Things will become more clear. Okay, at the age of 13, Hitler has his bar mitzvah, yes? And from now on, he's told he's responsible for everything that he does. Oh, sure. Well, at what age do we become responsible for everything that we've done? Well, the law says we become responsible for some things at 13, others at 14, others at 16, others at 17, others at 18. You've got to be 40 years old to get elected to the Senate. It's all nonsense. It's all rules of thumb that should not be ontologized. In a sense, no one ever becomes responsible for anything. And in another sense, everyone is always responsible for everything. Or in Levinas's terms, really, for everything. Okay, now I come to Korzybski himself, and just for 20 minutes that we have left today, on violence. We come back to this formulation of animal righteousness. In general semantics, first of all, I should say this, because everyone has been thinking this, including myself. So you're really saying that if we practice with the structural differential and with the devices, etc., we're going to change the world? Well, Korzybski thought so. He did. You can find moments, at least in Science Sanity, where he really seems to have thought so. You can find other moments in Science Sanity where he seems to be admitting that it would be a long, tough haul, but it was a worthy game, something like that. This formulation occurred to me to help me to justify my involvement with general semantics, that in general semantics, we could put it this way: we may have something like a premonitory model. Premonitory, rather. Not simply therapeutic, revolutionary hyphen therapeutic, but premonitory, in a sense utopian. Okay? A premonitory model of what human evaluation would be like in a radically saner, more democratic, more highly evolved society. Not just another revolution in the series of distorted, failed revolutions since 1789. And they've all failed. 1789 failed, 1776 failed, 1917 failed, Mao's revolution failed. And the revolutions that are now being hatched will fail, insofar as they don't tackle some of the issues that we touch on here. For example, no socialist regime has abolished prisons. No revolution has ever abolished prisons. The French Revolution didn't abolish prison. The English Revolution, Castro didn't abolish prisons. Lenin didn't abolish prisons. Mao didn't abolish prisons. Chavez has not abolished prisons. And the next bunch will not abolish prisons. All they do is put in a different population of prisoners. A somewhat different population of prisoners. So there's really a lot of overlap among all these regimes in the treatment of crime. Now, if you think about the rubric that we judge a civilization according to the way that it treats its weakest members, hey, Delacroix is its weakest member in that story as far as I'm concerned. So that's the way we treat him. Well, there's no capital punishment now. Just solitary confinement for life in an 8x11 cell with 1 hour in the exercise yard and a constant threat of rape. Hey, there's progress for you. Okay, I'm going to come back later again when we talk about Gandhi to this question, because I think it, rather than the more obvious victims of civilization that we pretend to be concerned with, it's in the prisons that we don't show any concern for people at all, much at all, that you can really... And there was only one socialist leader in opposition who made a big deal about prison. That was Eugene Debs, and that's why he's my hero. The leader of the American Socialist Party wrote only one book. It was about prison, his own experience in prison and his views of the prison system. And of course, Emma Goldman also opposed the prison system, but she was a crazy anarchist. I mean, it's the anarchist's job to oppose prisons. I don't know how serious they really are about it. Anyway, there would be a radical diminution in human violence. And so now we come to Korzybski's formulation, copying animals. He says human beings can be conscious of abstraction. hey, a human being can follow her breath and go to a place of self beyond stories. Fido can't. A human being can be conscious of abstraction. Fido can't be conscious of abstraction. Okay, no matter what similarities we may find between human beings and other living beings, there's no way of bridging that gap. Human civilization is something that can improve itself. That's what Korzybski means by time binding. A chimpanzee might learn to use a tool, but chimpanzee civilization, if you want to call it that, can't improve itself. So we have this ability, we, human beings, have this ability to be conscious of abstraction and to relate to the different levels of self in self and others, but we don't nearly as much as we could. We copy animals. Now, this notion of copying animals has at least two related meanings in Korzybski. One of which is that we copy animals insofar as we identify our map of what is going on with what is going on. Animal identifies map and territory, and insofar as human being identifies map and territory, we're copying animals. Or in his colorful language, we're being categorical and dogmatic. But the other way in which we copy animals is that we perpetuate and even intensify the violence characteristic of animal life. The violence which he calls primitive. We don't like to use the word primitive that way these days, but this guy's writing in the 20s and 30s, so give him a break. Like, you know what he means or what he's trying to say. Animal violence is intensified among human beings because for animals it's instinctual and innocent. Animal violence is innocent. For animals, and Korzybski does, he calls them selfish, and he calls them cruel. They are space binders rather than time binders. They have no history, they don't live in time. They live in space. In space, their object is to survive. Human beings live in time, they're time binders. They can make history, they can improve human civilization. The human violence draws on the power of the label levels to rationalize and moralize violence. Thus, animal righteousness. No animal is righteous. So in this respect, the human is the animal. Animal righteousness. Constructing violence as inevitable. That's one of the great works of evolutionary psychology in the past few decades. It's constructing it as inevitable. And we reconstruct it as inevitable. Well, that's just human nature. And we reconstruct it as morally right. It's moralized as a conviction of the righteousness of self and the evil of the other, the demonization of the other. And these days we make a specialty out of demonization of the other. In fact, it's gone to the extent of demonizing the other as a demonizer of the other. So it's like, you are demonizing the other, right? And I am the other that you are demonizing. But I never see myself as a demonizer of the other. It's always the other who is demonizing me. Everything gets turned in on itself and turned against itself in current political discourse. So this is a really fascinating phrase, animal righteousness. I am love, you are hate. That's one of the rubrics under which I'm going to be discussing nonviolence later. The animal kills to eat or in self-defense, but the human kills righteously, vindictively, vengefully, seeking retribution above and beyond, way above and beyond self-defense. Okay, well, where I go from here is go back to the Korzybski's description of the relation between cortical and thalamic levels of the brain, which are in parallel to label and object levels, and talking about this cerebrothalamic pause, or the fraction of a second of psychological delay, and I now go back to that and talk about that in relation to the matter of violence, which I didn't really touch on before. And so this is a good place, actually, for me to stop.
war is to men what
Motherhood is to women.
Childbirth is to women.
Yeah. War is to men what motherhood is to women.
Such a weird slogan.
But it's not just Mussolini. Up until World War II, there were many people who believed that war, and this is their idea of class war, they believed that war, destructive war, was essential in order to wipe away the obsolete and to prepare the ground for the construction of the new. And that's what Mussolini meant. That women create life through giving birth and the violence of giving birth. And men create new civilizations through the practice of war and reconstruction.
and we're